When most people think of Nazis, they conjure up newsreel images of row upon row of goose-stepping stormtroopers invading and violating a terrified Europe. But it's worth remembering, behind a bad man, sometimes there lurks an even worse woman. Why has the role of women in Nazi Germany been almost entirely airbrushed from history? Why has an assumption been made that half the population were not active and powerful participants in the rise of Nazi Germany?
Well, here's a book from 2019. It is the authoritative biography of Hitler. And do you think that any of the women that I'm about to describe even is in the index? No. This is all about the public Hitler, what he looked like from the outside, from the men's point of view.
In approaching this history, one must kind of unpack all the bias that exists as far as what we think are kind of preconceived notions of femininity, or the fact that women, that's not how they behave, that women don't participate in genocidal programs, that they're apolitical.
Such is the strength of the propaganda from the period. It's easy to see how historians may have been seduced by the myth of German motherhood. Safely cosseted in a world of peace, love, and devotion to husband and family, German women claim to be untouched by the moral and political horrors swirling about them. These romantic notions can now be laid to rest by the cold, hard facts. Women were utterly complicit in the murderous regime. The women who supported Hitler and the Nazis made an active choice, driven by selfish opportunism and total conviction. Many knew exactly what they were doing, covering the reality of Nazi brutality with the soft glow of motherhood and domesticity.
They played a huge role, and their role was partly important before the takeover. They played such an important role partly because the Nazi male leaders ignored them. They were so concerned with masculine activities, they thought, oh, the girls, you know, the little brown mice.
Who were the early female leaders who tethered themselves to Hitler in the expectation that their influence would rise with his? Who were the wealthy female financiers vital to Hitler's radical movement? And how did the female population of Germany find themselves instrumental to the Nazis' rise to power, whether they knew it or not? When it comes to Hitler's appeal to women, it was evident early in his career and grew as the Nazis' domination increased. But what was his own attitude towards the women of Germany? It didn't take him long to understand their value to his populist movement. After cooling his heels in prison, following a failed coup in 1923, the so-called Munich Beer Hall Putsch, he found his female support base was still focused and strong. In stark contrast to his male associates who'd put their energy into squabbling and power plays.
The men started fighting with other men. They were rivaling to take over. They were rivaling to start their own little mini parties. But the women followers didn't disagree with one another. They weren't ambitious like the men. And so afterwards, then it finally occurred to Hitler that one of the qualities that enabled him to pull his party back together again were those faithful women.
With the failure of the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler and the National Socialists realized they needed a less violent, more respectable route to power, the ballot box. But it was not their natural game. To be successful, it was going to come down to one thing: finance. For a decent vote-winning campaign, the party was going to have to integrate itself with German high society. So Hitler set about opening the hearts, minds and purses of the moneyed set. And it worked. with Hitler catching the eye of some morally unsavory, yet outwardly respectable society queens. Once on the hook, these matronly women were to become the devoted patronesses of the enigmatic Herr Hitler.
So Bavaria, which is your traditional German homeland, Bavaria, the women there, which is worth a lot of money down there, they were right-wing, and suddenly you've got this man, Adolf Hitler, standing up and saying, I will make Germany great again. I will put Germany where she belongs, top of the tree. And so that's what interested the women.
Soon Hitler had hit on the perfect line for his besotted female legion. There'd never be a woman in his life for them to feel jealous about. Publicly, at least, he'd stay a bachelor, telling the Nazi faithful, my bride is Germany.
I think Hitler hid his relationships partly to embody a kind of pure masculine ideal, someone who wasn't encumbered by domesticity, by a wife or a girlfriend, and he became this almost personification of masculinity. Also, a bit like a celebrity or pop star, it allowed other women in the general population to fantasize that they would be Hitler's girlfriend or wife. I think he wanted to create an image of being without need, without dependence, a pure, self-sustaining hero, really.
Hitler knew the way to financing his power play was through exploiting his hold over women. In 1921, Hitler was introduced to Helene Bechstein, matriarch of the famous piano-making family and prominent member of the German aristocracy. Not only was she fabulously wealthy, she was well known for her anti-Semitic rants.
She was Bechstein from the piano manufacturers. I mean, her husband and she, they ran the company. They were anti-Semitic, both of them. And Helene Bechstein was actually boycotted by some people because of her anti-Semitism. That, of course, appealed to them as well, because Hitler, right from the beginning, was clear. The stab in the back came from the Jews.
On receiving Hitler at her mountain villa, Bechstein took an instant liking to the intense young politician. And Hitler must have sensed that here was a big fish, ready to reel in. She began showering him with gifts and donations, one of which included an open-top Mercedes that met him at the gates of the prison on his release for leading the beer hall putsch. Party insiders were quick to notice that Bechstein, who was 13 years his senior, lavished on him an ecstatic and faintly maternal devotion.
People like Helene Bechstein were attracted very early, and it really helps if you're a fundraiser, if a very prominent, respectable person donates money, that attracts more money. And because Helene Bechstein was so well known, and so was her husband, with the support of Helene Bechstein, then other friends of the Bechstein also began to sign on.
Helene Bechstein took Hitler under her wing specifically to teach him etiquette and how to move in the circles of the aristocracy, because obviously the support of the aristocracy was very important to Hitler gaining power. One of the reasons he gained power, he obviously needed the aristocracy on his side.
Most accounts suggest relations between Adolf and Helene never made it past the platonic, yet there was no doubt that this was an intimate bond. Hitler was to be seen sitting at her feet, with his eyes closed and his head resting on her bosom, while she stroked his hair. The reality was their relationship was likely more maternal than anything else, with Helene even stating she would have liked Hitler to have been her son.
They all became mother figures for Adolf, sitting with on the floor, and his head on their laps, and they're stroking his head. You know, one of them actually wished that Hitler would marry their daughter. Didn't happen, you know.
I mean, it would certainly seem that Hitler's relationship with his mother would be an important template for later relationships, and he would find it quite easy to be the sweet, good little boy who's seeking help and guidance and very respectful to an older woman. I mean, there's an opportunistic, more sociopathic side that could be about he saw who was going to be useful to him.
Helene wasn't the only wealthy matriarch who would take up the reshaping of Hitler. Another was Elsa Bruckmann. Born in 1865, Elsa was a real-life princess, courtesy of her father, a Bavarian prince, and a mother from Austrian nobility. Well-bred, she certainly was. But she also had a keen interest in xenophobic nationalism and anti-Semitic racism. Importantly, Elsa, wife of a literary publisher and incredibly well-connected, ran an influential salon where the cream of Munich society would gather to discuss the issues of the day. Elsa first encountered Hitler in 1921, when she was in the audience at one of his early party speeches. Elsa was hooked. She was to become one of Hitler's first big fangirls, and even visited him in jail after his failed coup attempt.
Hitler could have visits every afternoon. They brought him food. He dressed in lederhosen. And the Bruckmanns gave him access to a group of people who met every couple of weeks and discussed ideas in Munich. And that gave him respectability.
But just like Helene, Elsa felt it her national duty to work on Hitler's coarseness, his lack of social graces. It was from her that Hitler learned the essentials to being a successful political mover and shaker. How to correctly eat lobster and kiss a lady's hand.
Hitler was a rough and tumble country boy, but suddenly these women took him over and said, "We will show you how to carry on, how to live, how to be successful in society. Because if you want to make it big, that's where you need to put your effort. That's where the money lies. And you need to get people on your side. We will teach you how to eat and drink in public."
What was it that drew women like Elsa and Helene so strongly to Hitler? They were certainly not the only ones entranced by his intoxicating power. They also shared his warped beliefs and ideologies. They keenly felt Germany's humiliation after its disastrous defeat in World War I, and were angered by how the victorious Allies had imposed huge financial reparations on it and stripped it of territory and its overseas colonies. Hitler, they were convinced, would make Germany great again.
What we see in Hitler is the worst example, possibly the only example, of somebody achieving absolute power. This is somebody who came from being a complete non-entity in 1919 to a man who had the belief that he was going to conquer the world. So this just segued perfectly into his self-image. I am the greatest man in the world. I should control the world. And it picked up from there.
This story of a newly heroic, newly arisen Germany centers at first on Hitler himself, who has this kind of Elvis quality to him. He's a rock star, he's a superstar. Women fawn in his presence. And he also tells this fairy tale of this racial purity, of German Aryan superiority, of this Nordic body that has this great tradition to it, of the Vikings, conquerors. And the role of women in this story is you are both promised this strong country and you get to be a part of this strong country.
But one early patroness was more significant than all the others. The most influential and long-lasting of Hitler's devotees, her name was Winifred Wagner.
Winifred Wagner was terribly influential. Hitler, when he was in Vienna, spent his leisure time at operas by Richard Wagner. And that's where he got ideas of saviors and heroes and Germanic myth. And Winifred carried on the tradition and was very political and invited Hitler to come to the annual opera festival, which is still a meeting place for the German elite in Bayreuth.
The daughter-in-law of world-famous composer Richard. Winifred Wagner was born in London in 1897 to an English father and German mother. Orphaned at the age of 3, she grew up in Germany. Winifred was a nationalist and rabidly right-wing, fascinated with the Nazi mythology of blood and soil, the idea of racial Aryan purity combined with simple country life. She first met Hitler in 1923 at the annual Wagner Festival in Bayreuth. Before long, he was a regular fixture in the Wagner home, part of the family, his politics in perfect sync with hers.
Hitler had always been an opera fan, always. In Linz, he'd always gone to the opera, loved the opera, particularly loved the Wagner operas and their themes, this great Germanic heroes. So it wasn't very difficult then, you know, to get the Wagner empire, if you like, behind him.
Winifred soon enthusiastically joined the Nazi Party and, just like Hitler's other patronesses, started showering him with donations and presents. Her effect on him and his party was profound. As the 1930s rolled around, Hitler was still dogged by his roughhouse image, arising from the beer hall putsch and violent clashes between his fascist militia and their communist rivals. He needed an altogether more sophisticated veneer. Wagner's music would help him acquire it. When Winifred's husband Siegfried died in 1930, Winifred took charge of the festival, an opportunity Hitler wouldn't miss.
It was culture, and it was making Hitler a little less of a brutal street corner fighter, because that's what he was. This is the other side of him. Give him culture. Give him music that he can be proud of. Give the German people music they can be proud of. And they supported the Bayreuth Festival right the way through. Hitler went every year to the festival until 1939.
Well, the Bayreuth Festival opened the doors to all the other elites in the whole country. Through the 20s, Hitler was always at pains to increase his, we would call it name recognition, outside of Bavaria. And he wanted name recognition abroad. And seeing pictures of the elite at Bayreuth put Hitler's name into the category of nationally respected people.
Winifred allowed Hitler's control over Bayreuth to grow. By the time World War II started, the Nazis' stranglehold on the event was complete. Winifred always claimed Hitler was unaware of any Nazi atrocities. She died in 1980, never wavering in her devotion to him. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, more and more members of German high society were drawn to the Nazi flame. Anger and fear about the threat of communism and the dire economic situation created the perfect environment for Hitler's nationalist vision.
One of the reasons why wealthy members of society would have backed Hitler is because he offered a dream. He promised a dream that was extremely compelling and powerful when you think about the political situation, the humiliation and impoverishment of Germany after World War I. the seeds for the rise of fascism were sown. And so to have a charismatic leader come along and say, I will restore the greatness to this country, I will avenge all the wrongs that have been done.
He was their champion who would restore and protect their wealth and power. They thought they would prosper under Nazi authoritarianism, not realizing Hitler secretly despised their elitism, and little guessing the depth of evil that lay at the heart of the Nazi Party. The Nazis were working hard to persuade the majority of ordinary women to support them. Although women voted for them in fewer numbers than men in the 1920s, their contribution to the party's growing popularity was crucial.
What the Nazi women did for the party was extraordinary. Every time there was a rally, they showed up. They showed up with pamphlets to distribute, badges to distribute. They collected money. They collected charity. When poor Nazi families needed help, they collected charity. They took care of the kids. They formed children's groups.
This wholesome community outreach during harsh economic times made the party look as if it actually cared about the well-being of ordinary Germans.
When women are taking part in things like tending to the soldiers or running soup kitchens, they are accorded a particular status and sense of being do-gooders, helpers, belonging to the cause. So they're given a very acceptable, kind of idealized version of themselves and disconnected from the horrors that good work is actually supporting.
The women were relied upon by the Nazi paramilitary group, the Brown Shirts, for food while on duty and medical care following street brawls. Women's groups provided money and clothing, as well as support for the families of political detainees. And there were sewing circles and book clubs where women would read and discuss Hitler's writings and other party literature.
Nazi women created a subculture so that if you were a follower of the party, you could go to the Nazi singing competition. You could join a chorus. You could play soccer. You could travel to go and get reduced ticket prices to the theater or to the opera. So the Nazi women created a grassroots network that made their followers feel that they belonged.
There was one particular woman who, on the strength of her work with the sick and wounded, could be mistaken for someone who'd misguidedly been swept up in the Nazi mania. In fact, she was as ideologically motivated as all the rest. Her name was Eleanor Bauer, also known as Sister Pia. She would become one of Hitler's favorite Nazis. Sister Pia had served as a nurse in World War I despite not being medically qualified. She'd always been an extreme right-winger, but when she was acquitted of a public order offence, after an anti-Semitic rant at a Munich rally, everyone, including Hitler, sat up and took notice. But it was during the beer hall putsch, when Sister Pia treated wounded Nazis, that she cemented her place as a hero of the party.
Adolf Hitler decided that he would take a gamble and would make a bid for power. And so he launched an assault and attack on the main parts of Munich, the railway station, the post office, and so on. Sister Pia was the only woman who actually took part in that. She was tending to broken heads and bullet wounds because 12 Nazis were killed in the putsch.
She impressed Hitler so much, she would be given responsibility for building and running Dachau concentration camp, where some 40,000 people would die. While there was never enough evidence of Bauer directly harming prisoners, former inmates recall extensive bullying and suffering at her hands.
She invented this brothel train, with which she peopled prostitutes who were usually Polish or Ukrainian, who had no choice. They were brutalized into it, and they became prostitutes in the train, and they would go around Germany offering services to the Aryan officers on this train.
Aside from religious radicals like Sister Pia, for whom Nazism was an irresistible magnet, the big question remains: what attracted women to these misogynistic men?
There is something about Hitler that lots of women found appealing. Lots of women wrote love letters to him. And I think there was something about his character that people appreciated. And perhaps it's hard for us to look back and understand what that was. But I think they saw him as maybe a rescuer, taking them out of the difficult situation after World War I.
For Hitler, women were politically useful. Violence and intimidation counted for nothing if the party could not make a mark at the ballot box. He needed to woo female voters with a homespun Nazi image and message. But how could they do that with an underlying ideology of division and violence? Much of the draw came from Hitler's enigmatic magnetism. Observers described the rapturous reception women gave him as something akin to sexual hysteria.
As soon as he spoke, he changed his personality entirely. And I think that they, whether man or woman, I think they were drawn to this, can we even say charismatic little guy. Over these years, like from 1921 till he was arrested and put into prison, he changed his image from a little drummer to the leader, der Führer.
The rock star analogy is quite a good one. He would have been a rock star of the 20s and 30s, except he wasn't selling music. He was selling something a lot more dangerous. Certainly the remaking of Germany, and later, of course, all of the abuses and the Holocaust. That was what he was selling. So, yes, a rock star, but a dangerous rock star.
Hitler's powerful oratory, combined with the pomp and grandeur projected by the party, thanks to the genius of propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels, helped capture the imaginations and emotions of many. But other social factors were at play too.
I think support for the Nazi Party, particularly from the women, was a direct result, really, of the tougher times of the Weimar period. But again, it was the women who really witnessed all this chaos right outside their own homes, the fighting with the different political parties. And the women wanted stability. They wanted their husbands to have jobs. And that's why I think they found the Nazi Party so attractive.
In the Weimar Republic, thanks to the Constitution of 1919, women had equal rights. They voted. They had equal employment opportunities. That was guaranteed. They had guarantees of equality in the workplace. They had access that they never had before to higher education. Women had always gone to universities, but more women were admitted. So it was careers open to everybody.
The problem was, not all women wanted this change. They were being thrust into the front line of the professions and the labour market right at the time when pay and conditions had never been tougher or less attractive. For most, it was exhausting, low-paid agricultural work or assembly line drudgery. Many married women felt overworked and underpaid. Discontent was brewing. As more women poured into the workforce, conservative groups who wanted social order became alarmed. For them, the real and imagined terrors of prostitution, abortion, venereal disease, obscenity, and rampant promiscuity lurked in the shadow of this social revolution. By contrast, there were the Nazis and their comforting talk of a society harking back to a kinder, safer past. A time when women weren't under pressure to work, but were content to stay at home and be given status and respect for fulfilling the sacred roles of wives and mothers.
The Weimar Republic was probably the freest that women ever were in Germany. It was this great age of freedom and expressing yourself, not just in Germany, across the whole of the world. Hitler's view was, you don't really want to be enfranchised and go out after work 8 till 5 every day. Be at home. Do the job that you're really entitled to do. Do the job that you really want to do, which is raising a family and caring for a man.
Low-paid and dreary factory jobs, or staying home to care for your family. The Nazis knew for many women what the answer would be.
And it shows, again, the power of this dream, this return to some mythical society where women would be breeders of children, educators of children, nurturers of children in the church, in the kitchen, in the home. And although to us it would seem crazy that women would want to give up their emancipation, because it was framed as evidence of a kind of corrupted, debased society.
Leading the Nazi charge against progressive feminism was Paula Sieber. She predicted a dismal future for the newly emancipated German woman. Emancipation from emancipation was the Nazi slogan.
Paula Sieber was all about professionalizing motherhood. You might even say she was a forerunner for wages for housework, a movement in the 1970s. Paula Sieber wanted to see motherhood elevated to a profession, just like other kinds of professions. And that was her aim.
Housewives in their thousands joined a movement in the name of family rather than freedom. They worked within religious, patriotic, and civil associations to defend traditional morality and fight against decadence.
They were saying, we've had enough of emancipation. During the Weimar Republic, we've seen emancipation, and emancipation just left us worse than we were to begin with. We've lost the supports we've had, the family is weakened, our children run away, they run off to the cities. Give us life before emancipation. And that's what the Nazis promised. And they thought, with a strong leader like Hitler, there's going to be order.
But Sieber was by no means the only conservative pioneer responsible for getting German women to back Hitler's cause. Elsbeth Zander was another. She passionately hated socialism and was a fervent supporter of the Nazis.
She was a frumpy housewife. Oh, my goodness. She was a little overweight. She kind of slumped around, and she got in front of a crowd. And she straightened up, and she spoke brilliantly. And in a way, that's kind of the double personality that Hitler had.
Under what Zander called the holy flame of motherhood, she campaigned for women to join her in purifying German culture and defend its traditional morality against the decadence of Weimar. Zander's campaign struck a chord. Women were signing up to her party in droves. Her German Women's Order was soon officially recognized as part of the Nazi Party, and she received official permission to consider herself the leader of all female Nazis. Zander responded by announcing that from now on, women would leave the politics to the men and concentrate on welfare work and family support. Elsbeth Zander had undisputed authority over women from all social levels who were drawn to the party by the alluring picture it was painting of womanhood.
And they, all of them said, we like KKK, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. We will do what we're good at, and we will let the men do what they're good at. And wouldn't you rather rise up to the top of your hierarchy of all women than always be second-class citizens in a world where men pretend to respect you, but they don't? So that was Zander. And then there was Mother. Mother Gerda Deal. Her crusade in life was very religious. She was Protestant, and she was really concerned about women who had fallen. Fallen women was the polite term for women who'd had out-of-wedlock children, women who'd been abandoned by their husbands, women who were too poor. And she started independently her own network of houses called New Land Houses that would give women a second start.
Born in 1868, Gude Diehl grew up in a radically nationalist and anti-Semitic family. Just like Elsbeth Zander, she was an early fan of Hitler's racial ideology and formed her very own women's organization. But unlike Zander, Diehl was looking to rally the conservative and well-educated women, the Protestant establishment, to the Nazi standard. People just like her. Diehl opened a headquarters with 500 rabid supporters and began her fight against what she called the anarchy of values she so despised. As with other female leaders at the time, Diehl rallied against women's rights, which, she claimed, denigrated motherhood, housework, and women's culture. She went as far as to call for the elimination of paid labor for women outside the home. All of this was music to Hitler's ears. Both Zander and Diehl had felt imprisoned by the Weimar system and saw the Nazi Party's traditionalism as our German freedom movement. They preyed on women's fears about having to compete alongside men in all walks of life. Hitler offered liberation from this alien new world. On behalf of the women of Germany, these rising stars reached for the blue skies of Nazi ideals.
Despite the encouragement of the Nazi Party that all German women should be good German mothers and stay at home, some of the women loved the opportunity that supporting the Nazi Party would bring them. There was a sense of belonging and also a sense of power. You're supporting the leading party, you're volunteering for the leading party, you're overseas representing them. And so despite the narrative that the Nazi Party wanted women to be at home, to be mothers, these women also relished the opportunities that supporting the Nazi Party gave them.
Women like Zander and Diehl were allowed to create a movement within the Nazi structure. But they were in danger of overestimating their significance to the party hierarchy. The truth was, as long as they kept supporting the party, the Nazis didn't really care what they were doing.
Nobody censored them. Hitler, whenever somebody disagreed with him or challenged his viewpoint, Hitler would expel them, purge them from the party. Nobody purged women. Men just didn't notice them.
So each major female leader was free to set up organizations and follow different rules with their own objectives. They even felt free to interpret Hitler's ideas any way they chose. Even with all this noise, female support for the Nazi Party still lagged behind the men. It would take one more massive societal shift to really move the needle in their favor. And that was the Great Depression.
So the Depression hit first, 1929. It hit Germany faster even than the United States. Unemployment in 2 or 3 years became the highest in the world. Imagine living in a country where 1 out of 3 workers lose their jobs. And the unemployment rate was 1/3 for men, but only 10% for women, because women worked in the lowest paying jobs. But this disrupted everything. It disrupted family life. It disrupted politics.
As the Great Depression began to bite, the female Nazi vote rose to equal male support, and, in places, even to surpass it. The Weimar government was fatally divided and increasingly impotent in the face of the economic malaise. The Nazi Party smelt blood and amped up the propaganda to take advantage of the chaos. It was now between them and the communists, while moderates were left to die in a political ditch. In the election of 1930, the world watched on as the Nazis leapt from 9th to 2nd place in the Reichstag. The reason was simple. Men had been losing their jobs and were now languishing at home. while their wives were often still working. As many of these men grew increasingly desperate, women could see that conventional German family life was crumbling around them. Their hopes and dreams for the future were under threat. The Nazi promised to reinstate traditional gender roles, allowing men to again provide for their families, proved wildly popular.
Post-World War I, where the German men, Austrian men, were feeling completely humiliated and useless, the idea of being remasculinized would have been incredibly exciting, exhilarating, and seductive.
By 1931, however, so significant had women's support for the party become that the Nazi leadership decided to clip its wings and bring it closer to the mainstream party organization. It was decreed that all women's associations, big and small, were to be incorporated into what was called the National Socialist Women's League. Overnight, these organizations fell under direct control of the party and the men who ran it. Despite all their work and dedication to the cause, the female leaders were suddenly out in the cold. In one cynical stroke, they'd been stripped of their power and influence.
Hitler's in power. And all of his women followers, Paula Ziba, Guida Diehl, Zanda, everybody, they all think, I am going to become the leader. None of them did. Suddenly, the Nazi leaders cared about women, and their concern exhibited itself because all those women lost their positions. The Nazis had no idea who was going to be in charge of women, so their first appointment was a man who had no experience with women's anything, but he seemed to be a good Nazi, and so did the dirty work of firing and dismissing and discrediting those women.
The Women's League eventually had a female leader, committed Nazi Gertrude Schultz-Klink. But for women, the point had been made. They'd been naive enough to swallow the Nazi ideology and ignore what the party really thought of them. It didn't matter that for years they'd proved themselves to be Hitler's loyal and hard-working supporters. He'd never let competent, charismatic women gain real power. There was to be no honor in store, no final prize, no gratitude. Instead, for these women, it ended in bitter disappointment and betrayal. The Nazis' comforting slogan, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, was revealed to be a hollow lie. And as the war ground on, they'd become virtual slaves in Germany's factories, while their menfolk and children died on the battlefield, all in the ruins of their wrecked towns and cities. The reward for their unflinching devotion to the Nazis was sacrifice and death.